Hi everyone, welcome back to Lecture 5 on labor activism and government reform around the turn of the 20th century. There were a host of significant challenges faced by the American working class during the Gilded Age and early 20th century. We've already discussed some of these in a previous lecture, but let's revisit them now for a few minutes. To begin, most workers faced long hours on the job. While some industries were gradually trimming work hours, most laborers by the turn of the 20th century were still routinely putting in 10-hour days. In the steel industry, blast furnace operators had it much worse. They were forced to put in 12-hour days, 7 days a week. They only enjoyed 1 day off every 2 weeks. Long hours, forced to do repetitive tasks, meant that some workers experienced serious fatigue and problems with keeping their attention focused on the task at hand. That may not be a problem if you have a desk job, but in other industries where you were surrounded by dangerous machinery, sleepiness due to overwork could prove fatal. Further, no matter how many hours they worked, many laborers already had to navigate seriously hazardous working conditions. Each hour on the job meant exposure to toxic chemicals, for example. Or for coal miners, it meant breathing in noxious fumes or finding yourself entombed underground by unexpected mine shaft collapses. Railroad workers faced the most dangerous conditions of the day. In the United States in 1889, for instance, 1 in every 35 railway workers was injured every year. Worse, train-related on-the-job accidents killed 1 out of every 6 workers in that industry during the period. In other cases, it may not be the work itself that was deadly. It could be management-level decisions that ended up costing you your life. Take, for example, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire of 1911. A fatal fire broke out in a New York City sweatshop on March 25, 1911. A sweatshop is a derogatory term created to describe the cramped, usually poorly ventilated garment manufactories around the turn of the 20th century. Everyone was packed into such a small space with very little fresh air. What that meant is that laborers who were working hard in the accumulating heat often sweated heavily. This sweatshop was located on 3 floors of a high-rise building, the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors of the Ash Building. Workers there made ladies' blouses, known at the time as shirt waists. Management decided that in order to keep the mostly female workforce at maximum efficiency, the doors to the stairwells and exits must be kept locked during the work day. That would prevent theft, they hoped, as well as keep employee breaks to a minimum. This was a common practice in many industries, by the way, during the era. When fire broke out then, the workers were trapped with no means of escape. They opened windows to try and exit the building, but there was only a single, poorly equipped fire escape. That lone fire escape soon collapsed under the weight of frantic evacuees. Most workers, some as young as teenagers, died of smoke inhalation, burns, or from jumping out of windows in a desperate bid to escape the hot flames. The result of this tragedy was the investigation laid bare a lack of fire safety provisions for industries in New York State and ultimately across the country. Laws were passed in the decades following this disaster seeking to protect workers in case of fire, with adequate numbers of fire escapes, fire extinguishers, alarms, and the like. Coming back to the topic of issues working class Americans wrestled with at the turn of the 20th century, we need to say a word or two about pay. Women often earned significantly less than men in many industries, despite working just as hard and long as their male counterparts. This pay gap did not go unnoticed either, as many female workers will begin to lobby for higher wages over time. Also, we see pay cuts routinely in many sectors of the American economy in times of economic crisis. Take a look, if you will, at the graph that I have here on the slide showing the U.S. unemployment rate between 1869 and 1899. Notice that we have several cyclical downturns in the economy, and when the economy goes south, the unemployment rate goes north. Companies, in a bid to save money, will start laying off workers in large numbers. You see this especially pronounced around 1875 to 1877. You see it, the unemployment rate trending upwards again in the late 1880s, and then also reaching very high levels in the middle of the 1890s. If you weren't laid off altogether during one of these economic crises, you might see your wages cut. The railroad industry, for example, was notorious for slashing the wages of its employees, sometimes by as much as 35%. And you might get one wage cut this year of 10%, and then the following year, if the economic depression is still lingering, you might see another 25% pay cut the next year. Larger macroeconomic forces completely out of your control, in other words, might lead to your pay being cut significantly. Meanwhile, your landlord is not reducing your rent. You still have to pay the same for groceries and other needed items. All the while, you're working an incredibly dangerous job for even lower wages than before. Now is a good time, therefore, for us to explore the labor union movement of the 19th century. First, let's figure out what a labor union was. Broadly speaking, a labor union was a coalition of workers in the same industry. So auto workers might form their own union. Coal miners might form their own union. And why are they joining together? They're joining together to achieve common goals. What were these goals? Well, many labor union members wanted some of these endemic problems that we've already discussed to finally be addressed. They wanted higher pay in some cases, especially for dangerous jobs. They wanted something simple like an 8-hour workday instead of being forced to labor for 10, 12, 14 hours. They wanted safer conditions in the workplace. They wanted protective goggles. They wanted respirators so that they would not asphyxiate and become sick and possibly die on the job. These are but a few of the many different issues that various labor unions organized during the period sought to address. So how did they hope to achieve this change? They sought to change things for the better through collective action. By increasing the number of labor union activists, they can flex their muscle by approaching their employers and saying, "We are the majority of your workforce, and we are unhappy." It's ultimately a numbers game. If you can get enough frustrated workers to abandon their jobs, production will slow down or come to a halt. So a general strike or work stoppage was one of the key tools that many labor unions employed during the period. If they've already asked numerous times for, safety protective gear and management has refused to give it to them, then you get enough union members to agree to stop working and production grinds to a halt. At that point, management will be forced to listen to you and hopefully address your concerns. What we will see, therefore, during the late 19th century will be a series of labor strikes that occurred nationwide as labor unrest continued to mount. We'll begin with the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. This one was born out of several years' worth of an economic depression, and railroad workers were seeing their pay cut year after year after year. When a general strike was decided upon and called, thousands of disgruntled workers began walking off their jobs around the country in the hopes that their demands for better pay would finally be heard. Very soon after the strike began, all railroad traffic around the country ground to a halt. Unfortunately, before long, newspapers began reporting episodes of violence erupting between marching labor union protesters, police, and strike breakers across the country. Take a look at the primary source that I have here on the slide, how the media was portraying these strikers. They talk about hundreds were engaged in firing or setting fire to some of the railroad cars, people pillaging the cars. They give other very vivid descriptions of people stealing everything from lead to Bibles to eggs and dry goods. What this media account does not describe, however, is that it is not labor union activists that are causing this violence and mayhem. They have no need to cause violence and mayhem. All they're doing is temporarily stopping work so that their management will listen to them, and then they'd like to go right back to work. The media, however, will uniformly portray these labor union activists as rabble-rousers, as troublemakers. They will play up incidents like these that took place during the Great Railroad Strike and say they're a bunch of miscreants. They're not doing anything good for the country. When in reality, it was not the labor union activists that were doing these things, committing this violence. Like I said, they want to just go back to work. So they're not interested in destroying their employer's equipment because that's what they need to work on when they go back to the job. In the end, the Great Railroad Strike was a failure, both for the laborers and for the labor union movement. The workers never got their pay raise, and the public now feared labor union members as supposedly lawless and dangerous men bent on wreaking havoc. As proof, they pointed to the fact that once the strike finally ended, 100 people had died across the nation and millions of dollars worth of property lay in smoking ruins. Despite receiving such bad press, however, labor union activity continued on the national level. One union in particular enjoyed spectacular growth, the American Railway Union, that will ultimately be led by Eugene V. Debs. Debs was sort of born and raised in the rail yards. He left school at the age of 14 to become a painter in the rail yard. By 1870, he was a fireman and held a series of jobs in this most dangerous industry. So if anyone understood the need for not only better pay, but for safety precautions and what have you, it was Debs. He will go on to become the leader of the ARU and will play a small role in helping to organize the Pullman Strike of 1894. The Pullman Company manufactured sleeping cars and were located just outside Chicago. During the next major economic downturn in the early 1890s, the company began laying off much of its workforce and cutting wages for the remainder by as much as 30%. The situation was especially hard for many Pullman employees because their boss was also their landlord. The Pullman Company had constructed company housing to house its workers in the city of Chicago. And at the same time they were cutting its workers' pay, they were not cutting the rents that they were charging these workers to live in company housing. Debs offered advice over the phone to labor organizers who began the strike, and theirs was a boycott of any train that came attached with a Pullman car. Before long, this was enough of a delay in the system that we start to see the ripple effect, that the railroad system across the country starts to slow down and ultimately come to a halt. At this point, violence began emerging, especially after federal troops were dispatched by President Cleveland to break up the strike. When the Pullman strike finally ended, 34 people had died, and again, millions of dollars worth of equipment had been looted or destroyed. Once more, the American public, reading about what was taking place, are having these negative thoughts about labor unions only being reconfirmed in their minds. As for Debs, he was arrested. And here's where things get super weird. What might you think he would be arrested for? Maybe disturbing the peace, something simple related to offering advice with, trying to get this strike up and running? No, he was indicted for violating the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. Well, wasn't that created to make monopolies illegal? Was Debs considered a monopoly? In a sense, yes. He was indicted on the grounds that the boycott that he called, which ultimately disrupted rail traffic, including a postal service railroad line, that by doing this, that he helped create a, quote, conspiracy and restraint of trade. An individual like Debs, who distrusted monopolies and, was someone who was on the side of workers' rights, will end up going to jail for breaking a piece of legislation aimed at breaking up monopolies, as odd as that is. Just as we've seen industrial workers beginning to organize to defend their economic rights, we will see another segment of the American workforce beginning to mobilize to defend their interest, that being farmers. We'll talk more about their movement in the second part of this lecture.